Said no one ever.
I think she just ignoring us. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Want to do that.
I saw Pete yesterday.
No, boy, I thought he fell off the face of the earth.
He was,
Where was he?
I was coming over here and I saw him down the street over there on Angelo.
Oh, really?
He started yelling, I was calling him, Pete. I told him to come to this city, but I don't know if he'll come. He said he didn't know if I'd go to dinner.
Where has he been? Okay, you can talk, son.
He's
I'm the
been,
one that has a bullhorn.
he says his kid's been visiting him from Kansas City. That he's been, that's kept him busy for a while.
John wore his hearing aid last night, Marjorie.
I am stunned. I am gobsmacked.
Yes.
You just- Why don't you wear your hearing aid more, John? And don't
Hello.
tell me it's
Two
gonna fall
reasons.
out. No, it won't fall.
I want to ride
So
my bike here.
Mark is
I'm
bringing
very good at
Isabella
losing
down.
things, or if it's bad weather, I don't want to risk it getting wet. But it doesn't really help that, quite honestly. It helps me if I'm at home by myself. I'm watching TV or listening to the radio or something, it helps them, but then I got everything right, you know, within a foot of me.
So were there a lot of people? I think there was.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Where was the help?
Here in the auditorium.
Oh, really?
Get all my noise making out of the way now.
One of those places had cookies and had cellophane. It's so noisy. This was kind of fun.
Yeah, Pete's doing okay, I was hoping he'd come. Hello.
Well,
No,
very strange.
traditional spots.
Our final lecture of the
Yeah.
semester
Oh,
on
don't
Tuesday.
tell me, don't tell me.
On
I break
Tuesday.
out in tears.
Yeah.
Yours was a final work in progress, Maria.
I think I see him. You've got him riding his bicycle now.
Oh, Pete's out there, okay.
Are you happy?
Very good. Yeah, he told me if he comes, he's gonna take his bike.
But it sure looks good.
Strawberries are good.
Like your I mean, I don't think for reasons, but I also notice that, you know, there are some constraints. Well.
Have a place for you up front. And the question of the day for you, would you like the tabletop podium or not? I do.
So but this is Anibal, first name is the director.
You can share out.
Make assumptions. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and thank you tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Use the German.
Yeah, I was wondering about that actually, too. Which one do you prefer?
You do.
family background.
Yes, you can.
French Catholic saint, German family background, American bastardization of the name. Yes. So the big white one is the advance. The one below it is.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see, but like.
I can't see that.
Either, but.
That's the song. Yeah, but I would see.
Nine.
Yes.
So when you want to go back to
Yes.
that one. This is the really cool, the top one.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's, I like that.
Oh, wow. I have that people.
So I have waters for you.
So
So
how?
we're relaxed, our supervisor, you can sit, you can stand, you can do whatever.
Lucky the last time with Marie, she had about a sublet. You do you know the word sublet?
No.
I would make sure you.
It's when somebody has, when a renter has a long-term lease, they want to give up part of their lease for a short period to somebody else. And so Marie was looking. Yeah.
No, I understand. Yes, no.
So Marie was looking for a summer sublet
Yes.
from someone in Boston.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Ladies.
So, but it looks like she'll actually want that. She was dealing with it at Boston University.
Otherwise, it's pretty good group.
And now she has, she's in the process of filling out the lease and it's for a student, it's a student's apartment at Florida State University, but that student is very close friends of her high school friend.
I can tell you that.
This is all in history university.
Okay.
And she's been very impressed how this friend of a friend, who she's gonna rent for, is very organized and seems very generous and friendly. So, you know, there's still some details to work out, but Marie wanted to talk.
It's just to her area. We should have to celebrate.
US, if you.
Yeah, I may have to.
You often need someone to be your guarantor.
Yes.
So she needed my specific information to be a guarantor, so. And then I also used the opportunity to ask her about how she's planning to navigate the university to Boston when she finishes there.
Well enough.
We didn't know.
It's very important.
But it looks like, I encourage her to make her entrance semesters spread out. She has the ability to spread out some of them. They don't have.
I don't know.
So I said, spread out your semester.
Back to what I said.
And also she's just, so that means she'll need one. We'll have to go.
It's very.
This is kind of, she doesn't want to. She's not a- That's fine. Marie, our friend Scott, is in Boston, David Scott's also.
Now.
It might be nothing,
Yeah.
or it might be, I always figure.
I will get out.
Yeah, right. So I'm saying.
Sorry, of course. I don't think it's like-
What is that? I can see it like that.
Position secretary of the advertising job. He said it may in fact be a second, so he prepared also, you know, second. Turned out it was a second interview. So that's still up in the air. Technology officer.
So maybe it's good to be a little bit something lower, right? That's still fine.
So anyway. About that.
Yeah.
Because I want to
No other. Yeah. We are. Time to do a new thing. Most likely, but then they get used to doing it and they don't. Much already, it's like 6 times.
Actually, you see the professors. Younger people. Because it kind of brings down the average.
It's really good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
No, it's great.
What I used to do.
So, maybe just. No, please, I mean. I think it's preferred to find.
Because he said.
How far did you drive?
It's like I can start it, then he said, well, so. Yeah. And there's also like better jazz.
Let's do it. No.
And how are you?
It just how young the special.
So what did you decide?
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Democracy.
Like I have a piece on.
Yeah, that actually. The bigger mistake. Yeah, I was telling you yesterday, it's my, you're going, going up is hard, going down is really.
French, does it?
I find.
En el verano llega. No, no.
Today.
May 11th. Yeah, I mean, actually.
Everything's scheduled out.
Dad. That's not. Yeah, I think she's gonna get stuck.
Both sides of your.
Yeah, so my parents are like,
So was this expected?
She had a seizure last week. Yeah. He said, okay. It's really taking care of itself. It's not super, yeah.
All right, thank you so much for coming to this talk. This is our last lecture series seminar today, and so I'm very pleased to welcome Isabela Mares. Isabela Mares is the Arnold Woodward Professor of Political Science at Yale University. She's working, broadly speaking, on comparative political economy and historical political economy. She's the author of 5 books, and the most recent one is entitled Protecting the Ballot, How First Wave Democracies Ended Electoral Corruption with Princeton University Press. She has other work on clientelism, on welfare state development, and so on. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Isabela. I'm very excited to hear about your work. This is kind of a reminder for everyone who's online, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. And so, if you want to ask a question online, we will make sure to also ask Isabela about that. You have some time to give your presentation, then at the end we have time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here and to see friends and colleagues. So this is, relatively speaking, a new project. I will be on leave next year trying to write a book. So I'm welcoming any feedback and suggestions that you may have. And sort of just to motivate the project, I mean, sort of if we can think back of the foundational work, and we can step on, parliamentary erosion was the first symptom of democratic erosion, both in the interwar period, but sort of also in contemporary kind of, democracies around the world. And yet we sort of, looking at the recently growing literature on democratic erosion, there's still relatively little emphasis on what is actually happening in parliaments in these times. And if we think and kind of, the broad themes that the literature emphasizes are, the role of executives and executive aggrandizement, party strategies towards extremist parties, also the work by Laura here, and an emphasis on voters, but very little on what is happening kind of in these parliamentary institutions. So that is in a way the motivation of this project, and it has several components, and I'm going to just discuss a few of them today, but maybe kind of in the Q&A, if you have interest, I can show you other empirical strategies that I have to study in questions. I mean, my main question, I approach this question on from the following point of view. I mean, we know that extremist parties enter parliament with a goal to provoke, just like they do in the electoral arena, and with a goal to undermine the functioning of these institutions, right? So I try to understand what is the response, what is the optimal response, what have been the strategies of mainstream parties relative to this provocation. So, how do they kind of, position themselves relative to this? What are the policy and institutional strategies that they can take? And what is the trade-off among these strategies? There's a lot of of the politics that I study. There's a lot of changes in informal politics and informal norms, and I'm going to just show you a little bit here, maybe not so much in the talk, but more maybe what I intend to do is give you an analytical framework to understand I mean, in a way, the menu of strategies that mainstream parties have, relative to extremist parties. I studied this project trying to understand, as a political scientist, I want to understand who supported which strategies and and under what conditions did we have a political coalition, supporting, the strategy of parliamentary defense, and which were the parties part of this coalition. I will draw on examples from, historical and contemporary examples that maybe I'm working in this project, I'm working with a long 100-year historical comparison between France and Germany, and you're going to see why. These are very, very different cases where mainstream parties actually respond very, very differently to the threat of extremists. And what I'm learning from this project is a much more proactive response in the in the French Third and Fourth Republic relative to the extremist parties, and the extremist parties at the beginning of the periods were the communist parties, where mainstream parties responded with dramatic changes in electoral rules, another kind of active strategies to stop extremists, and the absence of these responses, at least in the Weimar period. Okay, so just for the context, and kind of we know that in Weimar, extremist parties, both on the left, the communists, okay, which formed sort of in 1919, and on the right, came into parliament with a goal to undermine it. So, right, this was the explicit goal stated by the Communist kind of Party Congress, okay, beginning kind of with the mid-20s, but also sort of right the explicit goals of the NSDAP deputies. So here is a sort of a quote. The plenary session from Goebbels' diary is the first day when he was in the Reichstag. The plenary session is full of angry Jews. Parliamentarism has long been ready for its downfall. We will sound the death knell for it. I have already had enough of this comment. But also, sort of, right, I mean, we see the same kind of phenomenon in contemporary kind of, parliaments and sort of, right, and this is some sort of, right, statements from mainstream politicians about sort of, right, about, what they experience given the presence of a far right, AfD in parliament. Sort of, right, what we experience on the part of the AfD is a termination of everything that is parliamentary norm in this institution. You have pulled off the mask from your face, and what we see is the grimace of non-democrats. First comes the provocation, the rule breaking, the taboo breaking, then the relativization. And here, Marco Buschmann, right, from the FDP, sort of, right, former justice minister, saying again, sort of, rather than just describing, I'm just trying to, with these quotes, describe kind of, the phenomenon of sort of, right, erosion of parliamentary norms that I'm studying. Physical obstruction is intended to keep the parliamentarians themselves from doing their work through noise, through violence, and through a climate of threat. No, you're not concerned with the matter at hand. You are concerned with showmanship, with fodder for your channels. You want to add fuel to the fire there. That's what this lectern is not a place for you. And here is a data set that I have constructed using kind of, sort of, right, I mean, the speeches, the totality of speeches in the sort of, right, in the contemporary kind of, German Bundestag, showing that indeed, sort of, right, and kind of these informal, sort of, right, all these kind of informal interruptions that are sort of, right, part of this process of sort of, right, violation of parliamentary norms have significantly kind of increased over time. I can go into more about the right to be a measure of norm erosion, the tumult, the laughter, the disagreement, the kind of, okay, these are sort of, right, and kind of, violations of the rules, the procedural rules of the Bundestag, and they sort of, right, I mean, kind of, are part of this phenomenon of erosion of norms. So turning to the sort of, right, to the question on how I study this, I'm sort of, right, studying kind of these questions from the perspective of mainstream parties, and I'm studying this from the perspective of mainstream parties who are faced with anti-parliamentary extremist parties. Okay. And what I'm sort of, right, doing, and maybe kind of this is sort of, right, one takeaway, in a way, a framework that I want you to leave you with, and sort of, right, and how I kind of, classify the menu of possible strategies that mainstream parties have relative to extremist parties. You can think of them as sort of, right, in this kind of, simple typologies, a 2x2 typology, and sort of, right, changes in parliament and changes kind of, sort of, right, affecting the entry of extremists into parliament, the entry or exit. So these would be the roles. And then sort of, right, we could think of sort of, right, strategies that target individual politicians, or strategies that are collective, that kind of change the rules and that in a way target sort of, right, a collectivity. And in a way, the goal of this project is to understand sort of, right, how parties choose the mix of these strategies. But let me give you an example. So an example of sort of, right, individual strategies in parliament, so you can call them to order, right? You can kind of sanction them, and you can use the sort of, right, the existing procedures to sanction them. And I'm going to show you just next that this was the preferred strategy of the sort of, right, of the Weimar parliament relative to extremists. They were not willing to engage in more collective strategies. They used the existing kind of, sort of, right, rules to sanction politicians, and that the problem with this individualized strategy is that it is sort of, right, vulnerable to counter-provocation. Kind of, you call them to order, they sort of, right, provoke, then another sort of, right, mainstream parties kind of respond to this, and sort of we have this sort of spirals of provocation, counter-provocation. So this was a terribly ineffective kind of strategy, and I'm going to show you this. Now you can change the procedures. This is more costly, and sort of, right, and the mainstream parties have to agree. And they would impose also sort of, right, limitations on their own speaking time or on their own kind of behavior. So sort of, right, so that's more harder to engineer. Sort of, right, one strategy that I'm really fond of as I think about this sort of, right, the choices that you have is you can actually sanction them by taking away their immunity or by weakening the immunity of extremists. And that is sort of, right, and interesting to me as we think about this, and as you will see sort of, right, in these kind of contexts that I studied, this was something widely used in France, in sort of in the late 30s. Now, I mean, that is of course also vulnerable, kind of, sort of kind of, that there's sort of this very, very strong protection of immunity that exists in many countries. But to me, the sort of changes in the immunity is preferable to a party ban. Okay, this sort of, again, more individualized, and sort of doesn't infringe on sort of on the rights of individual parties. So one of the questions that I'm asking in this paper is, why was immunity not more used? Okay, and under what conditions do politicians decide to sort of to use this instrument that they had to sort of to in a way to remove people like rebels from the Weimar. And we're going to see that in the Weimar period disappearance, right? And finally, there is the whole possibility of creating the electoral system. And sort of Big Bang. Okay, the rise of extremist parties, or to sort of have party bans. And again, on this dimension, and this is why I think that this project is interesting, because we're going to leverage, okay, the differences between France and Germany to see that sort of faced with similar threats, okay, French politicians, okay, responded by taking the elections against it. And while sort of German policy. So this is sort of the menu. So how do I think about this? Okay, I think kind of my explanation has two steps. To understand this, the first point is that it is really important. I mean, and this is probably not like a new point. But to understand, first of all, the critical actor, in the way the pivotal actor is the party that is pivotal. Is the party that is proximate to the extremists. Right, so if the extremist party is on the right, the pivotal party, as we know from Levitsky and Ziegler, are the center-right parties. If the extremist party is on the left, the pivotal party are the the social democratic party. So it depends on the on the nature of the the extremist party, and that party has faces a strategy in a way that is their strategy has can be simplified, okay, to in a way two dimensions. On the one hand, okay, so this is how I'm defining kind of this this utility of these either it can be either voters or politicians of the parties that are proximate to the extremist parties, and they they have also in this utility function they also have a legitimacy parameter, by meaning it is defined in such a way that for certain values of this parameter there is an interval where kind of the extremist party is completely illegitimate. Okay, so the voter or the politician derives zero utility from it. So what the party does in in these kind of strategies, saying kind of even. So maybe you can see this here. Even in for kind of even if the extremist politician kind of takes a value here, proposes a policy here that is very close to the policy that is preferred by the voters of the of the center party, I'm going to consider them as democratically legitimate. I'm going to draw a cordon sanitaire or a demarcation. Okay, that is going to make any kind of collaboration with this party impossible. Either in the form of participation in committees, co-sponsorship of legislation, and so on and so forth. So I'm defining my response not just in terms of I'm going to collaborate with anyone that kind of has policy positions close to my viewpoint, but I'm going to also define this legitimacy in such a way that to exclude particular kind of particular actors. And so the question is really, if we're operating with these two, is how are these kind of parties choosing when and why are these parties choosing kind of different intervals of illegitimacy and ruling out kind of possible coalitions and possible coalitions or cooperations with extremist parties. And so I will show you that generally the simplest way in which we can get a grasp on this is by leveraging some kind of external shocks, some changes in the in the position of external actors, the Soviet Union that then dictates the position of the Communist Party, and then it dictates a strategy of the socialists whether or not a collaboration with communists is or not feasible. Okay, and that's so that is the first part of the analysis. But generally, if we distinguish just between a demarcated and a non-demarcated kind of, mainstream party, okay, that a demarcated party, so a party with those very tight intervals, right? A party that is not willing to engage in any kind of cooperation with extremists, then I'm going to sort of try to convince you today that these parties then will favor collective or systemic strategies of parliamentary defense. I mean, these are in the way the cases that sort of that I have alluded to in that typology that this is when we will see these strategies happening. But if the mainstream party is non-demarcated, it will favor individualized strategies of parliamentary defense than less effective one, and they will reject the collective strategies of parliamentary defense. So then the question sort of becomes in sort of understanding, kind of one, how these kind of demarcation sort of regions come about, and secondly, then how this affects, okay, sort of the choice and the mix of strategies. Moreover, sort of and kind of these changes in the electoral rules or these changing in parliamentary rules are, very, very complicated kind of, sort of endeavors. They require generally kind of, the formation of a sort of parliamentary majorities. And so sort of so, generally, and so what we observe from these cases is that they're more likely to occur in these cases that the Giovanni Sartori called polarized pluralism. The cases, if we have extremist parties on both extremes of the sort of spectrum, so both an extremist left and an extremist right, okay, and demarcated, okay, sort of center left and center right parties. I mean, these are the sort of the unique, in a way, kind of, conditions in which we see, okay, sort of collective strategies of parliamentary defense. Okay, and these are very rare, and this explains why kind of these strategies were more likely to occur only kind of in the very late periods, sort of in the Weimar period, when we moved to this polarized pluralism. So let me just put this in context and then show you how this works. I mean, these are just some of these kind of the periods in which I'm drawing on here. Okay, and sort of and I will show you sort of and kind of some differences in the sort of in the Weimar period between sort of the early period when the left was not demarcated, and as a result it rejected kind of all proposals for collective strategies of parliamentary defense. Then we have this very, very short period after 1930 when we had sort of 100 extremist Nazi politicians in parliament, sort of a very strong kind of communist faction that led to the formation of a majority among center left and center right parties on collective strategies. We're going to see that in contrast to Germany, okay, France. The socialists were demarcated much earlier. Okay, beginning with the 1920s, they rejected any collaboration with the communists. And as a result, kind of very early on in the Third Republic, we see the adoption of electoral reforms that are trying to block the communist kind of period, the communist vote. Okay, the same is true in the sort of Fourth Republic France, when the socialists, again, initially not demarcated, but demarcated after 47, when kind of, the communists again took a very kind of, radical position. And here we see again another sort of moment when collective strategies come about. And finally, kind of, I'll give you examples from the Adenauer period in Germany, where initially, sort of we have a fascist party polling at around 11% of the votes. Okay, and the sort of communist parties. And initially, kind of, the Christian Democrats were not demarcated. They wanted to engage in a collaboration with the fascist party. And it is only after American pressure, after strong American pressure on Adenauer, that CDU demarcated and led even to these kind of changes in the parliamentary rules, expanding immunities, and to the adoption of party bans against both the far right and the far left. So demarcation, kind of this variable that I highlighted, is really crucial here. So let me just briefly show you the evidence in support of this proposition. So this is the Weimar Parliament, and this is sort of the hero of this first, part of the paper. This is Paul Löbe. He's a social democratic politician, and he was sort of, since the Social Democrats were the largest parliamentary faction in Weimar, he was the chair of the sort of the Reichstag in the entire period until the Reichstag is dissolved in 1933. Okay, he was sort of widely praised both by enemies and by his sort of by his colleagues, the social democratic colleagues. He was kind of impartial, a master of the highways of the raging parliamentary seas. However, the social democrats in this period were not demarcated from the communist party. There was significant kind of membership change across the parties. There were kind of coalitions between social democrats and communists, okay, in several kind of mounting actions. And so as a result of this non-demarcation, okay, the preferred strategy, okay, of Labour and of the social democratic faction was sort of this individualized strategy, the call to order. There was significant disruption in the parliament, yet sort of there was sort of I mean, the Social Democrats rejected kind of, any collective strategy to change parliamentary rules, and were addressing the disruption through the kind of call to order, through these kind of procedures of the parliament that I have here. When could they use it? I mean, they were very, very kind of codified according to kind of parliamentary procedure. If there was verbal violence against kind of members of parliament, anti-Semitic slurs, incitation to violence and disorder, then the politician could be sanctioned through call to orders. So I collected this data set of all the call to orders in the Weimar parliament, okay, sort of 1,400, okay, a very large number. In contrast, in France, we have only about 50. Okay, and this is sort of how the data looks like. Okay, so sort of heavily, as you see, sort of it increases over time, it increases sort of over time. And again, if we look at the kind of the composition of the, of the Weimar parliament, we see that sort of I mean, this last period, which is the period when, sort of the disruption is at its highest, is the period after the 1930 election when we have 107, sort of NSDAP, Deputy 77, communism. So a period of polarized pluralism, again to use Sartori, sort of extremist parties on both ends. Okay, so a brief analysis of this data shows that this is not sort of the strategy is most widely used in sort of later periods of the Reichstag. And again, it's not used on kind of policy issues, right? On issues already sort of encoding, the use of a strategy of the occurrence of a call to order, and sort of and encoding the kind of the policy dimension on which on which this interruption occurred. And you see sort of this more on these kind of democratic, I guess legal kind of reforms having to do with sort of parliamentary immunity or government formation rather than kind of social policy on taxation. But because kind of the mainstream party, the main sort of social democratic party was so in a way obsessed, I guess, with this strategy with the call to orders, they rejected, and the interesting thing is they rejected the other sort of possibilities that were kind of present and under discussion on the agenda, having to do that involved the more kind of collective changes in rules. Proposals to change the electoral systems were widely discussed in the Weimar period. Okay, the mainstream parties, especially the center-right parties, the Catholics and the Centrum, okay, were sort of actively, okay, supporting kind of changing electoral rule that sort of that was returning to the kind of the majoritarian system. It was believed that sort of that the proportional electoral system that Germany had was kind of facilitating the election of demagogues. Okay, the lists were too long, and sort of so parties could hide demagogues on the list. And we see sort of over time, and kind of these proposals, especially beginning with 1922, sort of center-right parties to return to the majoritarianism. But sort of but they were opposed by this. But I don't have a vote here. I will show you votes later. There was no actual vote. They never came. There's sort of there was no actual vote taken in the parliament because kind of the SPD blocked even kind of the discussion on the chamber. And sort of so we have this. I was just discussing this earlier. This very interesting kind of statement by Chancellor Pulling, the last democratic kind of chancellor of the Weimar period, that the failure to change the electoral system was the largest failure of the Weimar period. You could also change another sort of path not taken, another sort of collective strategy that was not taken was sort of you could change the procedures, you could change the rules, you could make it kind of sort of costlier to interrupt. And again, it is sort of the SPD that has sort of that blocked all these proposals until 1931. Okay, and sort of you could take away the immunity of politicians, right? And the sort of the discussion on immunity was, was highly, was a very, very intense topic, okay, in the Weimar parliament, okay? And here I have compiled the data of the total kind of cases of, total number of proposals to take away the immunity of extremist politicians that were sort of under discussion of every parliament in the period. And what I want to highlight here, it's sort of a complicated table, is that, well, first, the number is very high, right? We have sort of about 200 cases in just this very short parliament in 1928. But most of them are not resolved, right? Most of them fail because, again, there is no majority sort of supporting this idea. And it is only sort of very late, right? Very late after 1930, very late that sort of that a majority can form in the sort of in the parliament in support of weakening the immunity of politicians. And it is only then that sort of that the Social Democrats are willing to go for it. Okay, so it's a sort of it's a very late development, only in this last period when we had sort of polarized pluralism. So the bottom line is, here is the case of where the important, interestingly, kind of sort of the important actor is on the left. The important actor is not demarcated, and the important actor does not, the SPD, does not want to consider any of these kind of more aggressive, more collective kind of strategies of parliamentary defense. And this stands in contrast to Third Republic France. Okay, sorry, why am I so very fast? Okay, this stands in very interesting contrast. Okay, to Third Republic France. Why? Because the French socialists, in contrast, okay, to the German Social Democrats, were immediately sort of understanding kind of the communist threat. Okay, and they sort of they refused kind of sort of any kind of cooperation with the communists, and as a result, that this demarcation led them to endorse collective kind of strategies very early. So, what is the first one? The most important one that they adopted was sort of changing the electoral system to block kind of the communist kind of victory. So the socialists had been sort of a keen supporter of proportional representation. I mean, this was sort of the socialists sort of the Jaurès kind of line until until the First World War. When France adopts proportional representation, but then once the communists kind of rise, sort of the socialists understand that sort of that the majoritarian system with runoffs is a better way to block them. Okay, then the existing sort of majoritarian system, and as a result, there's a special Congress in sort of 25. The socialists changed their position on electoral reform, and they reintroduced majoritarian election. They support majoritarian election with the goal to block the communists. So we have this sort of here we have votes, and we can analyze them. So we have this sort of this political majority on the sort of the electoral reform in 1927. So it includes kind of socialists, radicals, and some Republican socialists, supporting electoral change. So an example kind of a collective strategy of defense. French socialists were also sort of much more proactive in using kind of in collectively changing the rules of the chamber. Again to block the disruption. So sort of so the most representative kind of example of this change is the sort of this new rule that sort of that Léon Blum kind of advocated beginning with the 1920s, the sort of the creation of an institution within Parliament of the Conférence des Présidents to allocate speaking time across different parties and to limit sort of the ability of extremist parties to disrupt. This rule that also that is maintained in the Fourth Republic, reduced the possibility of these extremist parties to submit amendments to limit that would kind of slow down and limit the legislative process. However, immunity, sort of there is a very strong protection of immunity in France, and sort of as you know, sort of France has the strongest historical kind of protection of immunity. I mean, this is sort of the country where this concept originated, and sort of in the legal doctrine at the time, immunity was considered a right that protects Parliament as an institution rather than individual politicians, and we see a lower willingness of sort of mainstream parties to modify, to change it. So even though efforts are made, these efforts fail. And it is only kind of, in 1940, at the time of sort of kind of after the sort of the beginning of World War II, when, the Communist Party takes sort of the position, supporting, sort of in support of the Russian position, the, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, okay, that's sort of right, that the parliament decides to take unanimously, okay, to take away the immunities of all kind of communist politicians. I mean, this is a unanimous vote in 1940. Okay, that's sort of right where this measure is activated, but very, very late. Okay, so in this period we see variation, okay, in responses to extremist parties, right? A much more aggressive, okay, set of strategies pursued in France as compared to Germany. Importantly, that's sort of right here, and to understand these kind of cases, as sort of right, we need to look at the role of center-left parties, and on sort of, and the variation, okay, can be attributed to the strategies of center-left parties. I'm going to briefly go to sort of right to the, just briefly to the post-war period to show you that again, it is the same kind of logic in a way that explains these cases. Okay, so post-war Germany, right, we had extremist parties on both on the left and on the right. Okay, initially, the mainstream parties were not demarcated. Okay, initially, sort of right, I mean, kind of, you know, the SPD hoped for a kind of a cooperation. I mean, they hoped that sort of right, I mean, these borders would disappear. Sort of right that a cooperation with the SPD would be possible, but also importantly, and then I didn't know this before the study, that the center-right parties, in fact, were very open to having a cooperation with the fascist party, the Sozialistische Reichspartei. Okay, and here is sort of a statement. I read all the, all the reports of the sort of the internal reports of the kind of the government at the time. Here's a statement of the justice minister at the time who was ready to stand for legalizing the neo-Nazi parties with sufficient material in the parliament. So what brings about this change is the sort of this change in the demarcation of the CDU. I don't know why I did it this way. Okay. Sorry. A bit too complicated. And this comes about after these critical election in Niedersachsen, where sort of the neo-Nazi party, the SRP, gains about 11% of the votes. Okay, and this kind of causes kind of sort of raises the question on whether sort of a coalition with this party should be possible. And it is here under very, very strong pressure, okay, of the US kind of high commissioner, okay, that sort of that threatens an active American intervention in German kind of domestic affair, that Adenauer recognizes that sort of that the party needs to demarcate, okay, from the SRP, okay, and intervene and sort of calling it the most dangerous party, okay, in the period, and sort of and allowing kind of sort of the initiation of a party ban against the SRP. A similar kind of ban is sort of initiated against kind of the Communist Party at the time, okay, as a result of sort of this also facilitated by the shift in the position of the SPD at the time. I mean, sort of there's a lot of sort of legal literature right now in Germany that is showing that the basis for banning the communists were much weaker than the basis for banning the fascists. Okay, importantly, also in Germany, changes takes much more dramatic kind of changes in immunity. Okay, it's the first time that sort of this principle that immunity is a right that protects kind of parliament as a whole and not individual politicians is being questioned. Okay, and we see sort of this change in the legal doctrine of immunity that makes it possible. Okay, beginning with this period, beginning with the 1950s, to use this tool systematically against extremist politicians. And we see even sort of very early on, as this sort of change is introduced, we see parliament taking away the immunity of both politicians on the far right and communist kind of deputies. So it's another sort of example of a collective change in immunity in the sort of mid-1950s. Similarly, France, okay, I'm going to end in this. France and the Fourth Republic, continue. So it is sort of a very, very kind of is a case that very much is very similar to what we see in the Republic France. So you see sort of initially in the immediate post-war period, we have sort of this kind of this tripartite coalitions between the a Christian Democratic Party, the MRP, the kind of the socialist and the communist. But we see very early a breakdown of this coalition. Okay, so the lead, the sort of the communists kind of leaving the government, And as a result, again, kind of the socialists turning against them, and again, changing the electoral system to the majoritarian system, to the kind of current system that France still has today as an effort to block the kind of communist threat. Again, as you see here, a policy that is opposed by the communists, but is sort of that's supported by all the other mainstream parties. We see similar sort of changing in parliamentary rules that try to block kind of communist disorder. Okay, strengthening of agenda control. Okay, the same institution that Leon Blum introduced is being reintroduced in the Fourth Republic. Okay, so all examples of kind of of collective kind of changes in rules that a demarcated kind of left favors. And here's sort of examples on the final bills, sort of the final bills on strengthening kind of parliamentary control of the mainstream parties against extremists being kind of favored by the demarcated socialist party. Okay, immunity. Okay, similarly, okay, is not successful. Okay, so in France, it's never sort of possible to use this policy instrument against kind of the communists. You see many efforts. Okay, I mean this is a very short period of time. Almost 500 cases. Okay, of sort of courts trying to get at these kind of politicians, trying to sort of to challenge their immunity, but only 6 cases adopted in this period. Okay, and interesting, that sort of the position of the left on this question is that sort of maybe immunity is not the right strategy. Okay, to use against kind of communists, because kind of what is the point of using sort of strategies? I mean, that target one politician at a time, given that sort of everything that the communists do is sort of the result of the party in a way pushing for these extremist strategies. So what the socialists were considering at that time were a ban on the Communist Party rather than the use of the immunity. And I'm reading you just to end here, sort of and this is Jean Michaud, that he's the head of the kind of, the parliamentary kind of commission on immunity, a socialist. He says charges against 4 or 5 communists, okay, may not achieve the desired goal as long as the Communist Party continues to exist with its troops, cadres, cells, and groupings, okay, having the means of expression that is the gallery of the parliament. So a questioning on whether sort of immunity will achieve this goal at all. So what I try to do here is think of the menu. So provide a sort of typology of the menu of strategies that mainstream parties can use against communists, and I'm distinguishing between individual and collective strategies with the implicit assumption that collective strategies are generally stronger and are more effective in blocking disruption and then also blocking the sort of the entry of these extremist parties in parliament. Importantly, that is maybe not surprising, but that it is sort of what matters here to understand when and why such strategies are adopted. We need to look at the proximate mainstream party. And in these kind of historical cases, I mean, sometimes the proximate party is the sort of the socialist party. So okay, so that is sort of the strategy of the socialists that explain maybe some of the variation across the cases. If the proximate party is demarcated, I wanted to show you, and I hope I have convinced you that the demand for these collective strategies is higher. If it is not demarcated, such as the German Social Democrats, then the party will favor these individualized strategies, call to orders. Okay. The majority is hard. In support of these strategies is very hard to accomplish. It requires cooperation among center right and center left. And in these cases, it was more likely to occur in periods of sort of polarized. So that is where I would end my presentation.
Yeah, my name is Marianne Knoyer. I'm a visiting fellow here, and originally I'm from Germany. So of course I'm very much, I'm very impressed by your comparison. I very much like your design. I think it's super interesting that you compare the interwar Germany and interwar France and the post-war Germany and France. I think this is really an absolutely convincing comparison. And your results are super interesting. I would now encourage you to do the next step, so to say, And this is maybe also half a question. If you would like to, if you are thinking of including into your analysis the more contemporary time period, you know, so you mentioned it at the beginning of your lecture that, of course, the situation by AfD in Germany or Rassemblement National, Front National in France are interesting now also because we have, again, a threat from the right and from the left. In Germany, not so much. I mean, the Linke, we could also qualify as left, extremist left. So the question would be, and I would really like to hear you to discuss a little bit more about party bans, for example, which is a big issue in Germany, you know. I don't know about France right now, but in Germany at least. And of course this, and I think this is also very interesting that this can be connected to the whole idea of militant democracy. Because, I mean, so to say, the Weimar Republic is the inventor of the militant democracy with Carl Schmitt and Karl Löwenstein. Yes. And of course also with, and here I was missing a little bit mentioning the Grundgesetz, you know, our constitution, because I don't know how many constitutions have enshrined militant democracy. And I don't know how far this is known. I mean, that it is the case that we have in our constitution, Article 20, which is the right for every citizen to resist against any person who would threaten our constitutional order. And then, of course, the party ban. And here I would, I would just invite you to maybe
actually results. So,
yeah, I just to encourage you to maybe discuss this in a way that.
Well, so this is so, okay, yes, but party ban, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the broader point that I'm trying to make, I will show you results on the party ban immediately. I mean, there's several points. One is that the party ban is in this sort of menu. Once we look at the menu broader, the party ban is, in my view, normatively less desirable than sort of than these individualized kind of, you know, sort of strategies, like I'm taking away the immunity of politicians and so on. And sort of as we consider, okay, not just policies of parliamentary defense, but also sort of broader kind of set of policies. I mean, one has to look at the menu. 1.1, and I'll show you in a minute because I have a survey that I have done in Germany on the sort of party ban. The second one is that sort of to understand these strategies, the first step is to understand whether center parties are demarcated or not. Right, and so to predict whether or not sort of I mean, you would engage in such a strategy, kind of, it is really important to understand the demarcation. And that is sort of I'm trying to study this, but it's very, very difficult to study empirically. Okay, so to what extent the CDU today is demarcated or not from the far right, right? Is a sort of right and kind of and I have many sort of results on this. So just I'm trying to get it. So I have done this sort of survey in Germany, in sort of at the part at the time when let me just get the slides up. Okay, at the time when sort of I mean after, I mean I have done several waves of this. The results are very, very kind of strong. So how does this survey look? So it has many parts, but one is a sort of is a vignette that gives that first of all asks voter whether they want the party ban, and then gives them two sort of informational treatments. One that is explaining sorry, to go back, that is explaining to them that sort of that there may be a legal hurdle. It may be hard to bring about. Okay, kind of because kind of, you know, previous cases I mean sort of in the 90s have failed, right? So respondents are reminded of the legal hurdle and are reminded of the kind of political costs that sort of the party ban may kind of, you know, legitimize and may increase, in fact, the membership of the far right party, right? By sort of by allowing them to sort of to take up this theme of victimization. So we want to see how these treatments then modify the support okay, for the party ban. So, and so the result that we have, and that is, and then I'll come to this. The result that we have that is pretty strong, and I have done this 4 different ways, is that sort of among mainstream party voters, support for the party ban is very high. It's at 65%. 65% of mainstream party voters in Germany support. Okay.
The party ban.
Yes, yes.
And
Which
this from which year is this?
This is like, so I said 3, but this is after the protest, so it is last year. Okay, but I have 3 waves, even in the kind of current election, it's pretty stable. But once you remind them about these kind of legal and political hurdles, the support declines. Okay, sort of right, it is less than a majority of center-right vote. But then I mean, sort of right, but the interesting thing I think that I'm doing in this survey, and then this is correlated with norms. Okay, so norms about sort of right, about kind of demarcation sort of explain the intensity of support. Okay, so if you believe that this is a legitimate, that militant democracy is a legitimate instrument that democracies should do, then your support is higher. Okay, so this is one result. But the more interesting, I think, kind of result in this survey is that I'm giving respondents a choice between different instruments of parliamentary defense. So I'm asking them not just about the party ban, but I'm asking them, how would you think about lifting the immunity? So how do you think about party ban relative to lifting the immunity of the far-right politicians? And how do you think about sort of right changes in party financing and lifting the embargo financing? So I'm going through a variety of kind of options, okay, that are alternatives to party ban. And the result here is that generally kind of voters prefer these milder, okay, forms of militant democracy than the sort of right and the strong kind of ban. Okay, which is kind of consistent with what I'm trying to say in the historical, that once you give them these options, so for example, they would prefer immunity. Among the various forms of organizing the party ban, they prefer the party ban at the state level rather than the sort of the federal party ban, okay, et cetera, et cetera. So like it's a lot of results here, but all together, sort of right, that you kind of, I think kind of the results show that it is right, that generally kind of, in this kind of trade-off, that sort of right, that voters in this case do not go for the most extreme forms, but sort of would prefer a more sort of moderated, okay, form of militant democracy. So this is one, okay, sort of right answer. Now, the hard thing is to study politicians and how they, and so I'm hoping to field a survey among German politicians with the same kind of questions as the voters, the same sort of survey. And I'm feeling this in the local parliaments, in the regional parliaments, to understand, okay, so right, how the positions about these various instruments has changed. So that's one answer to the question. The other answer to the question is sort of right, as I'm doing this project in the kind of contemporary period, I mean, this demarcation is itself sort of varies across these cases, because what I'm finding, and I didn't present today, in the French parliament, is that there is a lot of co-sponsorship of legislation with the far-right party. So the norm of demarcation has been completely eroded in France in the recent part, where you don't have this anymore. So, but that is for me my first variable, so I cannot move to the second stage on understanding the choice unless I sort of can characterize demarcation. And demarcation in itself is currently under stress, and it has eroded very strong in France, less so in Germany. And as a result, one expects weaker responses today. But in Germany, it may erode. We don't know, right? So I'm just at the moment when these very norms, but that's the first part of the explanation is under change. So I'm trying to get at this, and then I have this other, I have other things on sort of interruptions and so on, where I can show you maybe later how I study this in the current part. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. This is a fantastic project. I have a clarification question and two questions about the framing of the book, really. The clarification question is about the concept of demarcation. When you didn't talk much about the formal model, but when you discuss a formal model, the implication was that demarcation was a feature of the utility function. Yes. Yes. And then at points you talk about demarcation as a strategy. So I would like to understand how you think about it. That's my first question. And then the two questions about framing. One is, it seems that the main dependent variable in this project is a collective strategies. And I was wondering, why is it that you're interested in collective? Why should we understand the decision to adopt a collective strategy? Is it because we have evidence that they are more effective, or because we find them more problematic, or what is the motivation? And in relation to that, you talked about disruption early at the beginning of the talk as something that is distinctive of anti-democratic parties. But I could imagine situations in which disruption is used for democratic purposes, and I could imagine many situations in which these collective strategies of exclusion are anti-democratic, like going back to Marianne's question. So how do you think about that?
I mean, yes, these are all hard questions. So it is a choice of a parameter. So it is a choice of this parameter D that is a sort of a strategy that gives you then, the sort of like the comparative statics.
Okay.
I'm just putting this, I think to me, this is visually, this is how I explain it to my undergraduates. It's visually the cleanest way in which I can kind of think about it and sort of showing that then you're willing to sort of to rule out kind of policy proposals that are very close to your kind of, your ideal point because of this sort of, okay, so that is just the intuition. I have a mixed views on, so we did this project on, so there was all this discussion in the German media that, the disruption is at the Weimar level. Okay, so I, measured this, and then true, it is exceptionally high. Okay, and sort of I have the data here. The point is that the far right really, the number of disruptions per deputy is a very high period. But then if I went back in time a few lectures, it's very hard to measure this because you need to do it's a lot of effort. I agree with you that, that the disruption in total is, I was surprised it was quite high earlier. So I agree with you that maybe, okay, sort of I'm kind of, it is, sort of we over exaggerate the kind of the contemporary, sort of erosion. But on the other hand, sort of once, because I'm trying to understand also the disruption in itself, how it is used as a strategy. And it is, one can say that this qualitatively of a different kind because of sort of on the one hand, the verbal violence. So the content of the disruption is of a very, I'm sort of the kind of the shoutings and the things that they say to each other. And sort of, so I can show you that to convince you that maybe as in numbers, maybe it's not different, but in the sort of the tone of interaction, the verbal violence that one has in parliament, it's qualitatively different. Then I'm sort of we can study kind of these disruptions, sort of interruptions, then sort of this whole, which I'm not showing in the talk, but this whole pattern that the far right disrupts and then the mainstream parties counter-provoke. So this counter-provocation by the mainstream parties where they use the same kind of language as they, so this is also new. Okay, this one didn't see this sort of, didn't see kind of this sort of, again, the verbal terms that are being used in these interruptions. Okay, so that is I think kind of, so okay, so to really nail this, one has to do this whole, longitudinally democracies, non-democracies, kind of, and to me that is, super interesting. Maybe I'm not doing this in this kind of broad project because I just want to do the strategies, but I'm really interested in this, what happens in these interruptions and how the mainstream parties respond and how we end up, to me, this is the spiral of erosion is just that when the mainstream parties then do the same thing as the extremist parties, right? That would be, to me, the definition of parliamentary erosion. And I can send you the paper. I think I have done this in the contemporary Bundestag to show this. Okay, now on the, I'm not so, I don't know. On the, is collective better than individual? Clearly it is. It blocked these extremist parties. The communists kind of almost disappeared. Then the socialists, of course, changed the position. So if the goal is, blocking the electoral strength, then I think they were effective. Okay, but I'm more interested in how to think normatively between the trade-offs. Among them. So and how to think about these militant democracy measures. I'm just trying to say in this point in the literature, where the literature is, I'm trying to intervene and say, well, there's more than party bans. Okay, and they all have, normative costs and benefits, but also political costs and benefits. And and when we look at these moments, parties choose a mix of them, and it's kind of, and normatively, if you ask me, I would say immunity is better than taking away their immunity, and blocking them this way is better than a full party ban. And this is actually what the voters also think. So I don't have yet a final conclusion, but I'm just trying to get at this by showing kind of, sort of normative and political costs. But I would sort of, kind of, if you ask me today, what is your view? I think kind of, the missed opportunities in these cases where they didn't go for the collective ones. Well, the only thing that the Social Democrats were doing were these kind of, call to orders, very legalistic, now very kind of, here's the rule, I'm gonna, call it order, and not willing to consider anything kind of, broader than that. So I think that was a missed opportunity. So I would say normatively, and then yes, how do you evaluate effectiveness? I don't know, I don't want to end up doing also, I could do like, legislative output on other sort of measures of the dependent variable to see, sort of, which one is better or not. So I think there's other criteria that one can use to motivate, to justify them. But yeah, so these are very good points. So I wrote a normative piece for this APSA task force. I had to write a piece on militant democracy, and and I think yeah, the literature is old and we need to update it to the current moment. This militant democracy literature is kind of, we have to think about it in different ways, I think. And this is where I came down on. It's kind of, individual, take away their immunity. Okay, if you can do two things, party ban, or I would just go with this. But I don't know. And I think kind of these cases, we speak to this. I think kind of France is militant democracy again, before we thought about it. No one thinks of France as a militant democracy case. Okay, but it is a more effective one. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's very, very interesting. I just wanted to point out that the Sartori model doesn't really capture some things like religion and politics. Right? So some parties are tied to religious expressions, others not, right? And both in France and in Germany at that time in the 30s, right, before the Second World War, these things made a difference, right? And so the Centrum and the SPD couldn't get together, right, in order to form parliamentary majorities because of that long-standing opposition. And that made politics in Germany at that time different in a non-Sartori kind of way, right? Now the same thing happened in Chile, right? Now, when it comes to the Communist Party, the Communist Party did have, there was indeed the Communist International, and the Communist International had different phases.
Yes.
And so in the class against class period,
yes,
it was impossible for the SPD and the KPD to get together, right?
Yes. Which is this is why the shift, that's when they demarcated, and that's when also the French. Yes.
Right, but see, so the Third Republic continues beyond that classic against class period, and it goes into the popular unity period.
Yes, that is the exception.
Yeah. And so there are these external factors that is non-Sartori kind of factors that affect the way politics operates. Now, in addition, there's even though some parties were totally opposed, if they were on the same side in terms of laic situation, on what it meant to be laic, right, in France, they would nonetheless make electoral alliances in ways that you present your candidates in such and such a district and we'll support you, but as long as you support us in other districts. And so even though the parties were opposed to each other and even diametrically opposed on the laic versus Christian dimension, they did make these deals such that they would support the candidates in districts where they knew they could, like the Radical Party knew it could not win, right? And in opposition, then the communists or would support. So there was an exchange of that nature, and they didn't agree on anything in the parliament, but they knew they had to preserve the electoral alliance in order to be able to win. So that paralyzed them when it came to expelling or try to sanction a member of the opposite party with which nonetheless they had these alliances and convenience.
I agree. I mean, I've written on France a lot, so like,
Yeah.
and I start, so, okay, I mean, kind of, okay, to simplify things. Okay, there's a left vote and the right, a left block and the right block. The left block includes radicals and socialists. Okay, the right block includes the variety of parties on the right. Okay, so right, with the exception of the period between, 38 was sort of the unpopular, where they allowed the coalitions, and this is where the kind of the radicals, this is where the radicals step down. Okay, this is sort of like the one period where this model holds. With the other sort of, with the exception of,
unity here,
yes, yes.
which
with
didn't
this
exist in
exception-
Germany, which didn't
Yes,
exist in Germany.
No,
Right.
but because sort of it's the electoral system, because it is a sort of rather proportional system. So with the exception of that period, sort of right, I mean, kind of in all the other elections, kind of, sort of right, socialists formed coalitions with radicals, okay, to block. Okay, this is why they wanted this kind of electoral tool. Okay, so this electoral tool gave them this possibility to exclude them because they knew they had a coalition partner on the left. Okay, so I think, but again, it is the demarcation period, because kind of, sort of rather than kind of, once Stalin, and again, to me, this demarcation, I mean, kind of is, there is an external kind of actor, right? Once Stalin says, okay, the threat is fascist, okay, socialists should unite, okay, sort of, right, and this has implications, and kind of the socialists drop demarcation. In this day, this is the only election. Okay, because I have then reverted one sort of after Molotov-Ribbentrop, right? So this is the one election when sort of right when kind of the coalitions with the kind of the communists become possible. Okay, but again, sort of right, I think kind of to me, the paper is in CPS, but the strategies of the left is dictated very much by the sort of by Moscow strategy. At least in the French context, one can kind of really easily trace it. Class against class, no coalition. Sort of right. Okay, so that to me, I think it is quite well accounted for, and this is why I stress this, and I stress this maybe more in the sort of right the second part of the talk. This kind of the sort of right the demarcation is to a large extent sort of right imposed also by these kind of external actors.
Yeah, but I think it's useful to have the multidimensionality
Yes.
of the party system
Yes.
in the international setting. In order to understand, I mean, why did all the socialists vote in the Weimar, the Vichy regime, right? At the end, they did.
Yes.
So all these things need to be put into in a larger political context, I think, right? In order to be able to understand the litigation.
Europeanist and kind of, it's I agree, but I do all this with the district level. I'm kind of look at my okay, maybe more. I mean, I guess in a talk I cannot fully okay, I get this. Okay, so Sartori not useful. I thought maybe we have a reference. Yes. Okay, good. Okay, I don't also like people don't like and students don't read Sartori anymore, so but it's sad. Okay, I thought I mean, when I was going back to the literature and I was trying to find some things that compare to politics that explain, I thought okay, but maybe it's not that because he doesn't have demarcation, right? He just, I mean, in polarized plural, there's no whether there is or not demarcation, but that makes a huge difference. So maybe it's not useful. I'm right. Okay, so that's helpful. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Really interesting project. I wanted to ask a little bit more about two concepts. Anibal already asked about the concept of demarcation, but I'd like to hear more. I mean, do you think of it as a continuous variable or as a dichotomous variable? And like, what empirical indicators do you look at? I mean, how do we identify demarcation? I can easily think of some things, but I'm wondering if what I would think of is what you're thinking of. And the other one is parliamentary erosion. I'm less clear what you mean by that. I mean, today a lot of political scientists use a concept, democratic erosion, and there are different ways to measure it, but it's a concept that I immediately get. I'm less certain what you mean by parliamentary erosion. How do you identify it or measure it? And how does that concept relate to democratic erosion?
Okay, these are very hard questions. So So I attribute and kind of demarcation, one can study it at different levels. One can study it at the level of the voter, one can study it at the level of the individual politicians, and then at the aggregate level, at the level of the party, but that is a mix of politics. So that's why I answered your colleague earlier that, I mean, how demarcated is that CDU today? There's politicians with different, if you want this kind of this graph, right? There's politicians with different, utilities
Sure.
of that. And, and kind of, they're announcing, yes, and so how do we measure it empirically? For me, the measure is this announcement, no cooperation in government, no cooperation in parliament. They're not allowed on committees. So it's a gradation, okay, it's a continuum, but sort of right, kind of they are, excluded from committees. We're not writing legislation with it. There's all these kind of formal announcements of the parties.
Formal.
Yes, formal, and that we can study. I think kind of that is, we have enough. Right. But then the question is, but do the individual politicians comply with it? And especially, how do we study this in the kind of the current context when this is eroding? And this is sort of what we need to understand is, who is eroding. And then this is again, this thinking of it as the individual level, right? You have a policy position. If your policy position is very much on the right and you think, say, migration is the one axis now, right? And you think deportation is okay. Right, and you have a center-right politician who thinks something very close to the far-right demarcation is okay, then, you have to have a very tight, okay, sort of, right, you kind of, demarcation sort of interval to not cooperate with that politician. And that's why we had this last incident in Germany where sort of a large number of them were willing to, okay, that shows you, right, that it's sort of, right, when it comes to, okay, right, it's more fluid than what we think. Okay, so I think we need to measure. Okay, so if I want to measure this at the level of which I would like to measure this at the individual level, politician, we have to measure these norms. Okay, so right, is it important? How important is it? Is it important? So you give them examples of different policies and sort of like, would you, if the AfD proposes this, would you support or not? This is individual level sort of question. I think we have much more heterogeneity than what we think. Now in France, we see this already. Because I've done this summer, like they are writing bills with the far right, left and right. Okay, even though they still, in the last election, you could think there was a sort of an informal, willingness. Now it was right, not always enforced to block. Okay, so it differs across parliamentary and electoral arena, right? That's also something that we don't know how strong is this. And I also want, and I'm not going to do this in this book, but I also. There's also like a cost of demarcation because kind of excluding them from legislation. When the far right is 30% and you're not allowing their bills to come to the parliament, then that's also like a democratic problem, right? Okay, so I want to understand how politicians think about this trade-off. Okay. And sort of right, and how, sort of, so Germany is the country that has now the strongest one, I would say. I don't know if you agree still, right, given the history, given the constitution, but it, sort of, will this hold in the regional parliaments? At the local level, we know they're already so it is a continuous variable in this sense. But I think kind of to understand it, we have to sort of, this normative part of the utility. So it depends. Also, if your policy, so it's a combination of the policy ideal point and the, and the sort of norm. Because if your policy is very much to the left, and so the norms will not necessarily matter. The norms matter for those legislators that are pretty close in policy terms that would want something very similar to what the far right wants. And then for them, it is costly to enforce it. So that's why I think this framework maybe, is for me, this is capturing this kind of this trade-off that they face now. So I think we would need to do more on understanding how this, maybe with colleagues here and others, how this is shifting and, and how strong it is. I don't think it is as strong as we think it is. So, okay, then on the second part was
parliamentary
erosion. I have to find this more clearly, but to me it is, I think I answered this before, it is this, well, parliament is an arena where provocation is high, right? Where it is about, so I have to show statements that show this, that it is increasing, and where then the mainstream parties also co-produce this. I think kind of, it's one thing when the extreme parties, they are there, it's about verbal violence. But at one point in time, have these kind of parliaments reached the moment when, you know, the mainstream parties are also sort of like fueling this, okay. So I have, you know, I have tried to measure this with interruptions, with the, you know, Mark has seen this, not going to go into this, but this just requires, so that would be my definition, okay? So rather than the intensity and the sort of the severity of these, and this is why the Weimar parliament is really interesting for this, because kind of these call to orders, you see that at the end of the period, the mainstream parties were doing the same thing as the extremist parties. Because they thought the only way to stop this is they were, you know, responding in the same way. Okay, even today, yes, maybe.
No,
Yes, even today, in the German parliament, I mean, kind of, you know, you answer by calling them Nazis. Okay, that is to me a symptom of erosion because, you know, you're no longer, I mean, you're, okay, Nazis, okay? That is heightening the rhetoric, okay, it's drawing boundaries, right? We cannot cooperate with you, okay, and it is sort of like contributing to this, okay.
I'm a little curious about that. I mean, calling a Nazi,
Well, but if you say this repeatedly, I would say I would believe that this is, I mean, then, and you know, this is, you might say this is just enforcing the boundary, this is enforcing demarcation. We are just doing what your model said you're doing. Okay, but I think this prevents cooperation or prevents kind of.
But you could flip that and say that refusing to call a Nazi is normalizing Nazis.
Well, but you can refuse to cooperate with them on policy. Okay, so that's there's other verbal, I don't have the text here. There's other ways of intensifying the rhetoric. So it is about verbal violence. So I need to find indicators for the tone in parliament, which one can do with text to show you that there is a change over time and that the mainstream, so that's my definition, that mainstream parties are doing two. Okay, there's a dramatic change and sort of it is a spiral, okay, because kind of it is initiated by the extremists and then sort of mainstream parties are also using the same sort of rhetoric. Okay, so that would be my, yeah.
I just have one, maybe also, I mean, like two fingers, because I'm not quite sure why you're looking so much and so intensely to the individual level. I don't understand this. And the more so because, and I think here's an important factor, at least in the German case, a lot of all what you're telling is so much dependent of the Supreme Court. I mean, all the rules for party ban, for immunity, for party financing, for banning associations, this is something you didn't mention, and all the other rules, parliamentary rules especially, like, for example, the election of the vice speakers of the parliament, which are not materializing because the parliament is opposing to elect a vice chair of the AfD. All these parliamentary rules, which would be interesting if you would include it, by the way, they are all ruled by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is a very strong third actor. I mean, nothing happens on this behalf without the Supreme Court. And I think you cannot look at it without looking at the Supreme Court and the interactions, because what the Supreme Court is ruling, of course, then has an impact on how parties are positioning themselves. And therefore, I think it's much more interesting to look at collective actors like parties than at the individual level.
Yeah. You know? I agree with this, and in this period, this is why these historical periods are interesting, because they give us this flux, this bigger flux. Okay, so just I still, you know, for example, like the party ban proposal has 200 persons signing it, and so it's an individual choice whether you sign or not. I mean, of course, they know it's not going anywhere, but why are 200? Signing? So, you know, so there's things, there's changes, there's policies on which sort of right we have room for individual action that gives us sort of right deviation. I agree with you that in theory, right, sort of right, it is the party. and again, maybe I'm too obsessed by the speech data that I have been using, but that is just a realm of the sum. I mean, kind of one. So I have all the interruptions by politician, by speech. So I know huge variation, right? They're not doing the same thing. They're attacking in different ways. Okay, and so there is, I mean, so right, once we go to this, level of sort of like behavior in parliament, if this becomes our dependent, now this is not here, but if this becomes what we need to understand, then there's so much heterogeneity among politicians. And so I think it's a combination of, so again, if one looks at sort of like support of all these things, I mean, there's variation within parties, okay, there's individual level. I don't know if I have it here, like I used to have the speech day, sorry, like I just too many things. Okay, but I have this in the videos. I have but I'll send you the paper on interruptions. It's all individual district level actually, which is very surprising. Okay, that explains variation and whom they attack, how they attack. Okay, having to do whether they need a coalition on the left, then they will attack the far right, or whether sort of right and kind of their sort of right, their path to victory is on the kind of right, and they're going to attack the Lincoln. Okay, it's quite surprising. Okay, so there's variation within the CDU politicians and how they use this strategy. So yes, I agree. I mean, kind of it depends on the level of the analysis and what the more interesting kind of dependent variable is. So yeah, I mean, not on everything. I'm granting this, but I think on yes, on the patterns, on the behavior, and I'm trying to make a call for we need to study this also, how the informal politics is changing in these parliaments. There's so much to learn, and then it's going to be very much an individual level sort of explanation.
I think we have time for one more question. Keep it brief, but
Yeah.
sure.
Hi, I'm Kelly McMahon, also a Kellogg visiting fellow. So you make a normative assessment. For example, you said you think the weakening immunity of individual legislators is a good strategy. So I'm wondering, when you think about what is a good strategy normatively, are you only thinking about the effectiveness of dealing with the extremist party problem in the current period you're studying? Or do you also look at the implications of how changing or violating those rules or violating norms can then be used against parties in the future that are trying to preserve the democracy?
Yes. So this is yes, because kind of the collective one on the kind of party ban, you think that this is, of course, this is then radicalizing the sort of right, the far right voters more. So there's a cost there in terms of sort of kind of what is the impact of a strategy on sort of right on the spread support for that. And we see this in the survey, we see this. Okay, so that is the kind of the long-term effect. So which one has stronger effects on polarization, on deeper? So the first question was immunity.
Just the idea. So I understand like a strategy can have a long-term implication on voters' preferences, what you just described, right? That example. But what about in a long-term implication in terms of changing the rules or norms that then not a mainstream pro-democracy party, but future radical parties could then use to help erode democracy? Is that something you take into account?
Think about, yes, it's very important. Yeah, I have not yet. Okay, I mean, these were, yes, thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much, Isabela, for being with us today.